A little pause on Shokken marketing effort and a little experiment on goal-based agentic coding. That's the theme for this week. Hello, you're watching the development vlog for Shokken, a restaurant waitlist management tool that is currently available on Google Play Store and iOS App Store. This is Bill from Shokken, and this is week 83 of development. Current status, as I just mentioned, the app is ready and published on both Android and iOS platforms. You can go ahead and download it and use it right now. If you're interested in free license, get in touch using the link as well as the email address in the description. 2 to 3 weeks ago, I started my marketing effort by going door to door to restaurants in the Las Vegas Valley and talking to them about my product, Shokken, and offering them free access to the subscription, which includes the texting component of the waitlist management part. I visited about a dozen restaurants and I discussed my results in last week's update. Long and short of it, I need to rethink my effort in terms of how to approach the restaurants and how to identify the ones that are likely going to be the conversion targets. So that's actually a much larger project than I originally had anticipated. In the same way that I didn't think that writing this app would actually take this long. And I think that the marketing effort, not knowing what I didn't know, I didn't realize that there is actually a lot of groundwork and additional preparation that needs to go into place before marketing can become effective, even if you're going to door-to-door in person. In any case, that's something that I need to think about and sort of work out a different strategy. That probably would be the update for next week or two, and I'm looking forward to that. In the week that immediately precedes this particular update, a couple of things happened. Number one, the provisioning profile, which is the certificate that you use to sign your app for the Apple App Store, expired. Apparently, they're only valid for a year. I don't remember that when I created my first provisioning profile. In other words, I could no longer upload my app binaries to the App Store for iOS publications. In other words, this needs to be fixed. Now, after doing some research last week, I discovered that typically the automated way to manage this, which I'm already doing with Google, is they have a cloud-managed publication platform where you don't build the app binaries yourself. You let Apple build the binaries on your behalf. And Apple has the keys, and Apple can then sign your Apple binaries by themselves. You're never given the key. Of course, why would they give that to you? But Apple can sign it on your behalf, and you never ever have to worry about the signing key expiring. I thought it was a great idea. Turns out that for this to work, you have to use their compute, which sort of makes sense, but I didn't think about this implication when I first looked into it. I thought I could just sign up and I could just do it without actually spending anything on their side. But no, you have to use their compute. In other words, the build of your app, of your iOS app, can no longer happen in your pipeline. You lose that control, which is fine. I mean, I don't have to, I'm not a control maniac. If somebody else can do the build for me for free, let them do that. And if somebody can do the build for me and manage my building certificates, all the better. But apparently, it's not for free. So for the typical, your annual fee that you pay to Apple to essentially have this license to publish on their platform, they include 25 hours of build time every month. In other words, every month you're allocated 25 hours of whatever you want to do on Xcode Cloud. And this allocation is shared between anything that you want to build and anything that you want to sign. Now, the interesting thing is, for an iOS app that's using Kotlin Multiplatform, it's a heavy job to build. And it takes the cloud builder 30 to 45 minutes per build. Now, sure, I could look into optimizations and some caching. I disabled auto caching because, sometimes they could result in some errors that might be difficult to resolve, and I don't really want to have to worry about that, so I just disabled auto caching. Yeah, okay, I understand that's part of the reason why it's taking 30 to 45 minutes for a single build. But if you think about it, if you do the math, you're granted essentially no more than 40 to 50 builds per month, which typically is fine because I do nightly builds for internal builds for testing purposes. In other words, at the very least, monthly, I'm expecting 30 builds. And if I have other sort of on-demand ad hoc builds, that would actually eat into my allowance. So as you can imagine, this quickly, like if I have a particularly active week of development, I can see myself chewing through the 25 hours of build time very quickly. So this wouldn't really work for me. Now, the alternative, of course, is doing it manually or building up your own pipeline to manage this process automatically, right? It's not conceptually difficult to understand that you have GitHub Actions. You can create some kind of workflow that periodically checks to see whether or not the certificate is expiring and then rotate it on your behalf. But stuff like privileged access and stuff like this has a decent amount of security implications, and you could make it work very quickly, but you also want to make sure that whatever automation that you build is actually safe for you, and that's not really something that I'm looking to do right now. Again, like, can I do it? Sure, but is it the best use of my time? I'm not so sure. In any case, so after some research, I just said, it's valid. The manual certificate is valid for a year. I'm just going to do it and renew it manually. So that resulted in a whole load of like nothing, right? Just like, oh, I'm going to automate this. At the end, no, I didn't automate anything. I'm still doing it manually, but it's okay. It's only once a year. So next year, summer, I have to worry about this again. That's all right. The other thing I was looking into doing was, last week I went to an all-you-can-eat sushi restaurant locally, and that's actually one of the inspirations for Shokken, and that restaurant is very, very busy, and then they typically have a very long line waiting outside, and they do have a waitlist management system, which is a primary competitor of mine, but that company seems to be not really updating their stuff, and the UI is very old. The way that it's used is not very, in my opinion, not very user-friendly, but it works. Right? I'm not like, this is my opinion. I'm not trying to shit on their product. It's a good product. A lot of people are using it. It's just, if I were to build this product, it's not something that I like to do. So, and Shokken is a new interpretation of that. In any case, so that's not the part that's interesting. What is interesting is, typically when we sit down in this all-you-can-eat restaurant, we run into an issue where the server would come and take the order for the table. Right? You're given a menu, and the menu is long and all-encompassing. It's dozens, if not hundreds of items on a menu. And the server comes to your table, and you're supposed to have one person reciting the order to the server for everything that the table wants. The problem that I kept running into is, this is fairly easy to manage if you only have one or two people. Well, if there's just one, you're just ordering for yourself. If you're two, talking back and forth would be very easy to manage. However, if you start to have a number of people, 3 to 4, if not more, you quickly run into this kind of a scale issue where coordination among all this group of people becomes quite difficult on this menu. Imagine I want to order, let's say, salmon sashimi. Well, they don't have sashimi. Salmon nigiri, and somebody else wants to do it. How can we make sure that the final order that we recite to the server doesn't undercount the orders? In other words, I didn't miss that guy's order or overcount the orders. In other words, I order it thinking that I've included his order, and then he orders it again for himself, and then you're overcounting it, and there's a penalty for over ordering. If you can't finish your food, you're charged a penalty, which, fair enough, that's to discourage waste. So this is a very, in my opinion, not a very big problem, but a real problem. And I thought, hey, this is a perfect time to see if we can close to one shot a web app that can solve this problem. And the goal for this web app is for it to be incredibly user-friendly, with high level of affordance and simplicity, and easy to use for people who have never used it before, and easy to understand the concept. So with all these in mind, I was thinking this app shouldn't be that difficult. And with the new goal-based feature that Codex comes with, I'd like to see whether or not I could do that. So what I did was that I planned in great detail with Codex back and forth. This part is still interactive. This part you still needs to do a lot of work, and back and forth with regards to the feature, the technology stack that it needs to use, the pros and cons of different things, and thinking through the product, right? How would somebody use this particular web app to coordinate orders, and what kind of use case, what kind of flow we're having in this product? And after all the back and forth, we settled on one particular model, the model that I think I would personally use. And then after that, we settled on the technology stack. We looked at the, I really want it to be mostly static and not really use Shokken. The current major app that I'm developing, inevitably it has to use a backend, and it uses Supabase. It's expensive. It's structurally complicated. It adds a new vector for attack if there's any security issues, and it's slower because you have to talk to the backend. For this, I want it to be as lightweight as possible. So we do have a little bit of a backend, but it's all sort of wrapped up in Cloudflare. So Cloudflare static worker assets is the place where the static site would be hosted. And we would use durable objects for session-based storage. Because again, we don't need people to log in. This is low friction, as low as possible. People don't need to log in. I don't need durables. I don't need persistent storage. I just need durable objects per session when people are doing, the ordering and stuff. So in other words, we do technically have a backend, but it's very, very lightweight. In any case, so after back and forth, we've come up with a plan for a new repo, the stuff we need to do in the repo to initialize it, to scaffold it with agents files, with the repository rules, with the checks and the tests and stuff like that, deployment infrastructure. And after that, I was like, okay, we have this list of requirements, and these are the things that we need to accomplish. And Codex now can use Playwright, which is essentially an MCP server that I can talk to open up web pages and examine web pages. In other words, if you're only developing a web application, it can develop and test, visually see stuff, and interact with the stuff on a website all by itself. Right? You don't have to do, you could, but you don't have to do that. So we're thinking, okay, so how about I set up one implementation agent and then one check agent, review agent, and have them talk to each other and then not stop their turn until the implementation is completely done. Very interesting experiment, because it immediately exposes some issues, because number one, there really isn't a built-in mechanism for two agents to talk to each other. Now, why do I want a review agent if I want to one-shot it? The quality improvement that you gain from the official review process, either with humans or with another agent, is incredible. Especially with an agent with a completely fresh context. It can often catch a lot of things that the implementation agent doesn't catch. And you want that. Now, there is diminishing returns when you set this up, right? You could conceivably set up 5 different review agents, but you'd be paying 5 times the tokens for maybe 10 to 20% gain in terms of polish. So I only have one, but I do want one. So now I don't really implement anything without at least one reviewer. In Shokken, it would be 2 reviewers. It would be a manual human reviewer, and it would be an automated Codex reviewer or a Claude reviewer. In any case, if you have an implementation agent and a review agent, there's no built-in way to talk to each other. However, you can sort of bodge one or makeshift one by using a state-keeping machine. And in this case, it's very convenient that GitHub, the comments in GitHub, can become a very good state keeping machine. And not just that, but also a log, a trail. So all that you need to do, or all that I did, was I told each agent to use GitHub issue to keep track of the process, and then have them each pull the GitHub issue. I set it to 10-minute interval pulls for 30 pulls till timeout. And if you see a signal to start your turn, you do it, and then after you finish your turn, either the review or the implementation, you end the turn by posting a comment in the state machine in the GitHub issue so that the other agent can pick it up, so on and so forth. This worked remarkably well. And the important thing to keep in mind is that even with one-shotting things, the models nowadays, even the state-of-the-art SOTA models, you can't really expect them to implement everything in one go. That just, that's mostly for YouTube. That doesn't really work in the real-life implementation. So you still want them to do piece by piece, and you plan this in the discussions you have prior to starting the implementation. Oh, we have 15 things we want to build, 15 features we want this website to have, and we'll build each and every single one of them. And I have the tests after that, and then the manual tests using Playwright after that as well. And the review agent would also use the Playwright tests to double verify. So in other words, every feature needs to be implemented, tested, checked, reviewed, and then fixed again. So as you can see, it's not one shot, it's not vertical one shot, it's sort of like horizontal piece by piece. What this means is that the agents do have to talk to each other, and then they do have to do this kind of I'm done implementing, please review. Oh, I'm done reviewing, please fix. Oh, I'm fixed, please review. Okay, you're fixed, now move on to the next implementation. This has to happen. And using GitHub is a very free and what I would consider in this use case, a very optimal way of sort of coaxing the process forward. The other thing I also discovered is that this takes a long time. It is amazing how, it used to be that up until this point, I use coding agents basically as a sort of a back and forth, right? I tell it what I want it to do, to explain things to me, to talk to me about certain things, and then to do certain things. And these typically return very quickly. With this, I mean, like, this morning, I kicked off another sort of a batch of jobs, like a dozen maybe, goals, and it's still running. Yeah, it's pretty, like, you could get into the implementation by reading through the log on GitHub issues. That's another benefit. Or you could get another agent to summarize it for you and find issues that the log might report that you might miss, because again, the log becomes pretty long, right? Because both agents are reporting everything into GitHub issues. In any case, so this is still very rudimentary. It's not, I mean, this whole agentic coding field is so new that everybody's trying to figure out the best workflow and stuff. But I think that this is interesting. And I need to start thinking about automating more of this when it comes to developing Shokken, because a lot of the manual things that I do nowadays, with the exception of perhaps human reviews, could be automated. In other words, I didn't have to be the glue for agents to start and stop doing a lot of those things. In particular, like, for instance, automated reviews. Now I'm the glue. I kick off the automated reviews. But that didn't have to be the case. So this experiment that I ran last week for this new, web app that I'm still, I'm not, the agents are still running right now, informed me in terms of what I want to improve in the process of Shokken development, not necessarily the app itself, but the process. So I think that's quite interesting. It's sort of a new, fresh breath of air coming from, I didn't really touch the app code for about a week. That gave me a little time to breathe and not think about it, and not think about the marketing part of it. And I think I came off with important insight and findings. in any case, this is a very interesting learning experience, right? Like the whole process from the beginning to end is educational in my mind. In my mind, it's a lot more interesting than signing up for boot.dev or a lot of those online training courses. What's more illuminating and educational and helpful than you trying to do it yourself, right? In any case, that's enough pontification from me for this week. I will see you next week.